Okay. So we'll get started with the webinar for today. So welcome, and not to mention good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Today we're going to talk about how we can link the multiphase flowing material balance results that we actually discussed in a previous webinar in December with the same speakers. Barry Ruddick, Leslie Thompson, and Narayan Nair. But before we go into that presentation, we'll cover a few logistical items. The first thing being that we're more than 150 registered participants, which means that everyone is muted by default. That means that you can't interact with analysts during the presentation. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those in the Q&A chat box to the right. The presentation is estimated to be between 45 to 60 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And the webinar is also recorded, and the recording will be available both on Whitson Academy and also on LinkedIn after the presentation. As I mentioned, Whitson Academy is our online learning platform. It provides us with essentially a web portal where we offer both topical webinars and on-demand pre-made courses, as well as tutorials. And a few examples can be things within the realm of what we do at Whitson, so PVT, gas UR, gas condensate reservoirs, and well performance, and we try to cater for all levels of different expertise. So if you're a beginner to expert, and on our webpage on the whitson.com/training, you can both look at our public courses for 2022, and you can also look at the next webinars coming up after this one on many topics related to fluids and well performance and petroleum engineering in general. Today we are going to take what we talked about in the last webinar in December with these gentlemen, which was a multiphase flowing material balance method that does not require relative permeabilities. And just to give a quick recap on that items, we presented kind of the two problems with existing methods. The first one being that existing methods require relative permeabilities as an input, and the second one being that the diagnostic plot tends to look like or it's very hard to interpret in short. While this new method does not require any relative permeabilities, it's a diagnostic plot that's easier to interpret and is also field tested on many cases and also verified against full physics numerical simulation cases. And it's technology that's been developed at Simrex since 2017, and now Simrex, after the merger with Cabot, is called Coterra. In this webinar, we're going to see how we can take those outputs from this analysis right here, where as emphasized on the screen, the slope is related to the pore volume, and from the pore volume you can go into or using your PVT properties and etc. to come up with your oil, gas, and water and place numbers. While now we're going to take that one step further and essentially look at how we can calculate the recovery factors based on this method. And that recovery factor analysis method is available in Whitson Plus, our software platform. It offers intuitive drag and drop functionality, and will automatically then calculate recovery factors after you've completed a few steps that these gentlemen will talk about. So over to the speakers today. We have three of them with us here. Barry Ruddick, Leslie Thompson, and Narayan Nair. They all worked on this technology a lot, from both developing the theory, implementing it in practice, and now using it extensively in the assets of Coterra the last, or especially since 2017. So on that note, I'll just give the word to Leslie and stop sharing and make you a presenter. There we go, Leslie.
Okay, good. Okay, so thanks for attending today. Today we are going to talk about how we try to, we'll talk about two methods.
We're now looking at just the presenter view. So if we can look at you can just display or change the display settings to look at the full screen.
All right, just a second. Let me try this one more time. Stop sharing. I know what I did wrong.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's dude. Let's try. Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, cool. Okay, so yeah, we're going to talk about a couple of methods we came up with, Barry and I, in 2016, 2017 to try to estimate recovery factors from our multi-phase flowing wells. Ryan joined us right after we developed all this stuff, and we started to push it out to the enterprise. And so he's probably one of the biggest practical users. So he'll come in after I talk at the beginning. I'll talk through a little bit of the theory. He'll come in and look at some field examples. Okay, so a very quick review. A month ago, we presented our multi-phase flowing material balance method. It's basically a method that just uses PVT properties and production data to obtain a plot of mass rate normalized density change versus mass material balance time. The slope of that line, if you are in fully developed boundary dominated flow, is 1 over the pore volume. We tested that extensively against more than 100 simulations, and you can't prove any of this actually works. It's based on a hypothesis that during boundary dominated flow, the rate of change of density with mass material balance time is constant everywhere in the reservoir. Now, I say that we tested this successfully against hundreds of simulations, and it worked every time. 2 days ago, Matthias came to me with a simulation where it did not work. He ran an undersaturated oil case in a compressible reservoir, and it gave pore volumes that were too big. And the reason it did that is because our current formulation does not take into account rock compressibility. Quick calculations show that if I put it in, I would get the correct volume. So I'm re-deriving everything with rock compressibility in it. And that's going to be hopefully tested and prototyped and tested by the end of this week or early next week, and then I'll push it to Whitson, and then they can put it into their software, and that will solve that problem. If any, you should be skeptical about any new technology, and I do encourage you to be skeptical about this. If any of you do come across cases that do not work, I strongly encourage you to contact Matthias, contact me through LinkedIn or whatever, and send me the examples where I can replicate it and try to figure out what's going on. I'd really appreciate that. Okay, so this is kind of what Matthias was talking about. If you look in Whitson, you open up the multiphase FMB plots. This is kind of what you'd see. You'd see the FMB analysis, the wellbore response, and the blue scattered lines in this points in this case. The black line shows you the slope that we picked. One over that slope is the pore volume, which we report up here somewhere. You also see the average density change, rate normalized density change for this particular reservoir. It's parallel to the line that you pick. It's not drawn parallel. It is actually calculated, and it should be parallel to it. It represents the response that you would see from an ideal tank. It's the best response that you could possibly get from the system. So if you see wellbore points falling below that, something's wrong. And more than likely you're getting interference from another well, or something is telling you something about your system. It's not the isolated tank that you think it is. On the upper right-hand side, you have the average pressure and the wellbore pressure plots. We're going to be using that in this talk. Again, average pressure should always be above your wellbore pressure. So in some cases, we had wells that were shut in, not by choice, but by weather, maybe for a week or two. They had downhole gauges, and you'd see the wellbore pressure actually go above the average pressure line. That was telling us that, the slope that we picked was probably, the volume that we picked was probably too small, and we could safely increase that volume pick to honor that buildup pressure that we saw. We also have a couple of saturation plots here. The one I just want to mention is the water saturation plot. Water is not a compressible substance, and in a tank you don't expect the water saturation to change a whole lot. You know, if you start seeing saturation of water changing from 30%, 40%, you begin to get a little suspicious. That's probably telling you that you're probably getting water coming in from more than what you think. So you have some formations that are feeding water into your fractures that you're not accounting for in your initial water saturation. In that case, I strongly recommend that you just turn off the include water and just consider it just like a hydrocarbon reservoir. And that'll give you the minimum possible size of oil and gas and oil and gas in place. So the actual oil and gas in place is somewhere in between the two. And then I'd encourage you again to go back and look at your logs and your interpretation and see what's going on. This is a little bit beside the point. I apologize. I got a little carried away. So I'll get back onto the point now. So we have a lot of stuff here. We have estimates of the volumes in place. We have the pore volume. And the question is, what more can we want? Of course, what we want is estimates of the EURs. How much of these volumes could we actually produce? To do that, we actually need estimates of cumulative producing fluid ratios at abandonment pressure. So where the hell does that come from? Well, there's a really good book that I like by Walsh and Lake that discusses these volatile systems. And he has a chapter in there on material balance, and he also shows that for these reservoirs, the recovery factor of oil and of gas, at abandonment pressure, are functions of the PVT properties at abandonment pressure. I apologize, it's kind of a busy slide, but for reservoir engineers, it should kind of make sense. So it's a function of those PVT properties at abandonment pressure, as well as the cumulative producing water oil ratio and the cumulative producing gas oil ratio. And also a function of the initial size of the gas cap, if there's one. I'll talk about that more in a second. So if you had estimates of these ratios at abandonment and you had the abandonment pressure, then you could just plug and chug and you'd get estimates of the recovery factors. You multiply those by the numbers that we got from the fluid material balance, and there you have it. You have your EUR estimates that are based on physical properties that you could hopefully measure. There's one thing in that book, he does a lot of cases for these recovery factors, but he doesn't consider the case where, if I recall correctly, he doesn't consider the case where we are dealing with undersaturated gas condensates, where SO is 0, in which case M goes to infinity. In that case, do not panic. If M goes to infinity, what you want to do is just neglect this term here, because as M gets large, this term gets negligible. And this 1 gets negligible, and then what happens is you can cancel out the M and you can cancel out a bunch of stuff, and you'll get the correct recovery factor for this system. Similarly down here, for a condensate system, as M gets large, these two terms, the BGDI and BGDI RSI, become negligible. You can get rid of them and cancel out the M's and so on, and again, you have the correct recovery factors for gas in that case. Okay, so if I look at the same example that I just showed, and the one that we had in Whitson, it's a real field example, and I plotted its cumulative producing WGR and OGR, and I prefer to use the ratios with respect to gas, because gas is always there. Oil is not always guaranteed to be there. What you'd see is something like this. It's very smooth. It's very nice when you're dealing with cumulatives. It smooths out very nasty looking data, and in general it looks like a very nice curve, and all you have to do is basically extrapolate it. Okay, so in this case you have a lot of data. All you have to do is extrapolate to whatever bottom hole pressure that you think you're going to abandon at. So for example 300, you read off what you think your cumulative values will be, and then you form your WR or your WOR cumulative or your GOR cumulative from these ratios, and you get your answer. It's very easy, very cool, and you come with numbers that make sense very quickly. We never actually implemented that in our software. What we did instead was, sorry, excuse me. What we did instead was just distribute an Excel sheet to our engineers and said, hey, use this and come up with these numbers. This could probably be very quickly implemented in Whitson if they decided to do this. And it's a very fast method of getting these recovery factors if you wanted to. Okay, so when we looked at this, Barry and I were a little bit more ambitious. We wanted something better. We wanted to try and figure out, try to estimate how would rate evolve with time, not only what the ultimate EUR would be. So we wanted to figure out what the oil, gas, and water rates, how would they evolve with time as we produce this reservoir. So we're looking for the holy grail. I'll tell you from now, we didn't get exactly where we wanted to. But we did get to a method that does give you reasonable recovery factors. And I'll show you how we thought about it, and I'll show you why we didn't get exactly what we wanted in the end. We got a cup, but it was not the holy grail. So let's just talk about things that we know, or at least that we think we know. First of all, we know production history, and we know probably if there's analog wells around, we know the production history of those wells as well. If we have production data today and that plots on a material balance line, a flowing material balance line, we expect that tomorrow's data will also plot on that line. So any future production that we have, if everything works correctly like we said it should, that data should continue to fall on that Multiphase FMB line. We also kind of have an idea of what the future BHP decline will be with time. That's kind of probably not exactly true. We probably do know, have an expectation of what this future surface pressure will be with time. And if we had a wellbore model, then we could hook that up and we could tune that into a future BHP with time. But for the time being, we're going to just assume that we know what the future BHP decline with time will be. And then this one is probably the most controversial thing that we think we know. So there's evidence both from simulated and production data, field data, that the instantaneous ratios, oil gas and water gas ratios, plot as unique functions of bottom hole pressure under two conditions. One, the bottom hole pressure does not become constant, and two, the bottom hole pressure is a declining function of time. Okay, so the prediction problem, when we're trying to predict EURs, we are looking at a depletion problem, right? We're not looking at cases where we're suddenly bringing pressures up and down, all this type of stuff. We're assuming that from this point on, the pressure is going to decline very nicely to whatever it goes to at the end. It may not happen like that in real life, but that's what we're assuming. And in our case, in Cimarex or in Coterra now, I don't think I've ever seen a well that actually got to a completely constant bottom hole pressure. It always is declining slowly. As I said, surface facilities may get constant, but bottom hole pressure usually doesn't. Now, as I said, this is kind of controversial because it actually caused big set of arguments between myself and a former employee, Steve Jones, who wrote a paper on this stuff, and said that producing instantaneous ratios with functions of average reservoir pressure. At times, these arguments got really heated. It turns out, as usual, that both of us were right and both of us were wrong at the same time. So he wrote a paper about these ratios, and he linked these ratios to the size of the reservoir. The thing is that he ran all his simulations on which he based his paper at constant bottom hole pressure. So he took that out of the equation. At the same time, when I was running my simulations, I ran all of them at variable bottom hole pressure because I was trying to simulate what we saw in the field. And so, as I said, we had really heated arguments. I said, hey, this thing is a function of bottom hole wellbore pressure. And he said, no, it's not. So as I said, it turns out we were both right and both wrong. If you take, and I only figured that out when I started looking at reservoirs that were identical, produced identically, everything was identical, except that they had different sizes. And of course, at the beginning, when they were infinite acting, they behaved the same way. But as the boundaries came in, what Steve said was absolutely true. So this statement that I have here, this third point, is true provided I'm looking at a fixed system. So I'm looking at a fixed tank, it's sealed. I'm not looking at it compared to anything else. I'm saying that for that system, if I produce it at some variable bottom hole pressure, I will get a unique GOR and a unique WOR. Those ratios will be affected by the size of the tank, but they will be unique as far as flowing bottom hole pressure is concerned. So if you believe that, then I have all these knowns. I can now devise a method that I will try to use to estimate not only the EURs, but the rates as well. Oops, sorry. So this again is what this would look like in Whitson. This is what we implemented on Whitson. And what you would be presented with is something like this. You'd have the OGR from the well. I like to plot this in Semilog plots simply because at lower rates, when you have lots of noise, you take ratios that get even more noisy. And I find that on Semilog plots, you see the functional relationship a little bit better than on Cartesian plots. Later on, when Ryan shows this stuff, he's going to be showing you the Cimarex version of these plots, the internal software. And we did not have this ability put in the Semilog plot. So he's going to show you Cartesian plots. But I mean, you could use either one. So what you would do is you would digitize, or you would approximate this OGR into the future. Similarly, the WGR into the future, the same way. Again, Semilog, you would approximate some sort of declining pressure function for the BHP, and Whitson has a nice little way to do that. And then finally, you have the curve on the fit on which you're basing this stuff. Okay, once you put all these things in, you get this magical recovery factors that come up here. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that. So again, if you remember back to a month ago, we had three working equations. We had cumulative OGR, cumulative WGR, and the flow material balance equation. And what I'm going to assume is that I have data up to some time Tn. Okay, I have production data, I have everything up to some time Tn. And I'm going to try to write what happens following the time Tn plus 1. So the OGR at time level Tn plus 1 is the cumulative production of oil at time level n plus 1 over cumulative production of gas, and that I can write as the cumulative production of oil to today, which is Tn, and I know this, plus the oil rate tomorrow, or the total amount of oil I produce tomorrow. And I'm going to write that in terms of the gas rate tomorrow times the OGR tomorrow. And I know the OGR tomorrow because I have I've extrapolated that into the future as a function of PWF. I know what PWF is going to be tomorrow, and therefore I know what OGR tomorrow will be. Similarly, the gas rate is the cumulative gas tomorrow is gas today plus the cumulative amount plus the gas that I produce tomorrow, QGR plus 1. And then I have on the other side of the equation what we had before. There's a function of it's the difference in accumulation terms, and it is a function both of pressure tomorrow, which I know is because it's at PWF, and the saturation tomorrow, which I don't know. So this equation is a function of the unknown gas rate tomorrow and the unknown saturations tomorrow. Similarly, I can do the same thing for the WGR. I'm going to show you that we can do the same thing for the flowing material balance itself. So let's just look at that flowing material balance. And if I multiply through by the mass rate tomorrow, then I get something like this. And I have here, this is the cumulative mass that I'll produce tomorrow. And this is the mass rate tomorrow. Of course, this is the density tomorrow. The mass rate, cumulative mass tomorrow is the cumulative mass today, which I know, plus the mass rate tomorrow. And the mass rate tomorrow I can write in terms of the gas rate tomorrow times some term. Again, I know everything in this term. I know the OGR tomorrow, I know the WGR tomorrow. Similarly, the beta, the density term tomorrow is a function just of the PVT properties tomorrow and the saturations tomorrow. So now what I have are three equations and three unknowns. The three unknowns being the gas rate tomorrow, and the two saturations tomorrow. You can combine those equations and you can eliminate saturations, and what turns out is actually a quadratic equation in the new gas rate, which, believe it or not, is a complete mess, and I do not recommend doing this by hand if you want to remain sane. You need something like Mathematica, and Mathematica itself takes hours to actually do this. I have it running right now for the compressible rock case, and it is hours. I'm not even joking. So once you get that expression for the gas rate, you can solve it. As I said, it's a quadratic. You get two roots. For every case that I've run, you get one positive and one negative root. So you just use a positive root, and you can get all the other rates using the instantaneous ratios, and then you accumulate them into the cumulative production for the following day. Then you step to the next day. So it's a step-by-step procedure, and you just keep going. And you can run these calculations for a fixed number of years or fixed terminal condition if you want. I think Whitson uses it to terminal average pressure, or you can do it to terminal average rate, and then you can obtain these estimates of EURs and recovery factors. So that was the idea, and again, that was our quest for the Holy Grail. So I'm going to show you an example of how this works. This is just a synthetic oil example. It's one fracture in a typical type of reservoir that we have. The properties aren't that important. And so what I did is I ran a simulation for this particular reservoir for 10,000 years. And these are the rates from it. And I said, well, okay, suppose I only have 200 days of production. So I'm way back here somewhere. I'm going to cut this production at 200 days. I'm going to try to analyze that 200 days of production. And I'm going to try to predict the next 9,800 days and see how well I do. Okay, so this is the FMB plot you get for the first 200 days. It turns out you don't get the right slope at 200 days. You get 89% of the right slope. So that's the blue line that I have here. The right slope is actually the red line. And that doesn't develop till a lot later. At 2 years, it's at 96%. At 5 years, it's at 99% or something. But it takes quite a while to get exactly the right slope. But you're close enough within the first couple of years to have a really good estimate of the size of the reservoir. It's just very slowly changing and getting to the right slope and the right intercept. But okay, so for the sake of argument, for the following example, I'm going to assume that by some miracle I picked the correct slope. Okay, not very likely in this case, I admit. I'm going to show you results both with the correct slope and without. By the way, this slope, the red slope, is correct. The intercept is not correct. The final intercept is not correct. It's actually going to be a bit higher than this. So both the slope and the intercept are changing very slowly with time. So in the following, again, I think I have the correct pore volume. I have the correct oil and gas in place and all this stuff. We'll see what happens. So this first plot shows you the OGR versus bottom hole pressure. This is BHP. And at 200 days, I'm at this blue point here. So I have this part of the curve, and I'm going to try to extrapolate for the rest of the curve. And I have three different extrapolations. The first one, case A, is that I assume that I miraculously picked exactly the correct extrapolation. And then I have two others. The case B is I'm very pessimistic. I'm following the RV curve. And I think it's going to be a lot lower than it actually turned out to be. And then case C is I'm very optimistic. I think it's going to be a lot better than what the trend above showed. Similarly for the water, I mean, this is a water case versus, again, bottom hole pressure. Notice that there's no way in hell that you could have predicted this, but let's assume that I could. So the blue lines, again, predict this uptake on the OGR. And again, I have the red curve, the red dots are the pessimistic case and black dots are the optimistic case. And these are, so when we run the algorithm, this is what happens. So the dashed lines here show the actual production over 10,000 days with that bottom hole pressure profile. And this red wavy line is what I predict. And that's the problem with this method. It actually gives, it doesn't give bad estimates of what the rate should be. It's just that the estimates tend to be wavy. And I think I've been trying to figure out why this happens. I think it's due to the fact that the slope and intercept are both changing very slowly, and I'm trying to fix it somehow at the wrong value. and somehow it's trying to adjust itself. By the way, this is a Semilog plot, so these big looking things are about the same size as the oscillations back here. So you get these oscillations throughout the whole thing. Again, this is the oil. Again, it doesn't look that bad on average. And there's the gas. I'm sorry, the water. As you can see, since it was so wavy, it wasn't very well. It wasn't what we wanted. It won't just go straight into Aries. You'd have to do something else with it, and we just never even bothered to look at that any further. If you look at the pessimistic case, again, the gas is pretty good. The oil case, the oil is a lot lower than before. Again, the same wavy prep, and the water is again also actually up here. You can't see it very well. The water is a lot higher than it actually was, and then at the end, it's more or less correct. And then the optimistic case, again, in this case, you got a lot of oil. Gas is almost correct again. You get a lot of more oil than you should, and you get a lot less water than you should. If you convert all these synthetic productions, the predictions that we get into an OGR, on a WGR, on a cumulative basis versus average pressure. So this is OGR versus average pressure from the material balance. Again, the green line is what you would actually get if you ran the simulator out. The blue line is what we get from our predictions, the blue points. They agree pretty well. And then, you have the optimistic case in black and the pessimistic case in red. So you get some sort of spread on what you think the cumulative production is. Cumulative ratios are, at abandonment. In this case, I guess whatever the abandonment pressure is, 700 psi or whatever. And again, you're starting from way up here, okay? And then this is the water. Again, we're starting from this point, and these are our predictions. So if you took those numbers, or if you just, you accumulated and just looked at the final production of oil, gas, and water cumulative. This is the truth case for oil, gas, and water, and the final average pressure from the simulator. And you can see that. So again, this is the case where I digitize everything great. So again, all of these first three cases are with the correct pore volume, and so you get some sort of spread in the oil recovery factors. It's not a huge spread, but it's there. The gas is almost correct. It doesn't really matter what you do. The gas is almost correct always. And again, you get some sort of spread in the water. And these last three just show what happens if I use the 89% pore volume instead of the actual pore volume. And again, you get some numbers that are a bit higher than you would get if you used the correct pore volume. But then again, remember, you're starting with volumes that are smaller. Your pore volume and your oil and gas estimates are smaller than they actually should be. So this again is not that bad. Again, gas is almost correct anyway, and this is water. So you'd just apply these. You just apply these estimates to the numbers that you got from the Multiphase Flowing Material Balance, and you'd get estimates of the EUR in place. The EURs from each of the phases. So again, we did not get exactly where we wanted. We really wanted the rates as well, but it doesn't do too badly as far as getting the estimates of EURs and so for each of the phases. So some final comments, I guess, before I turn this over to Narayan. Prediction method does not give reliable estimates of future daily rates. Are very wavy, but the cumulative fluid ratios are reasonable. The more production data you have, obviously, the smaller the spread between the pessimistic and optimistic cases that you have. So obviously, in the very first case I showed you, were close to the end anyway for the OGR and the WGR cumulative plots. It's very easy to extrapolate those. The problem becomes much more difficult the further away you are from the endpoint. But again, the closer you get to the endpoint, the better things become. You get similar recovery factors if you use the in-place fluid estimates at the early time, 200 days. They're a little bit higher, but it's not unreasonable. And then finally, let's start with the wavy predicted rate behavior, which really depresses me. it's related to the fact that these slopes and intercepts are not obtained suddenly. They come asymptotically. Somebody that's brighter than me out there could probably figure out how to fix all this stuff. But in any case, with that, I'm done rambling. I don't know, Barry, do you have anything to add?
I do not right now. I might have more after Narayan shows some field examples.
Okay, cool. I'll stop sharing them.
That's good, and I'll make Narayan a presenter. There we go.
You see my screen and hear me?
Loud and clear. Perfect.
All right, in the previous webinar, we showed 4 field examples. And in this portion of the presentation, I'll walk through those 4 examples because it'll be interesting context as you look at the flowing material balance that's associated with these 4 well types, and the recovery factor analysis on those same wells. So we started off with an Anadarko Basin Merrimack oil well. This is a bound infill in this play. And if you recall, here's the production plots that I showed at the previous webinar. This is a roughly 1600 GOR water oil well. I'm not going to divide, I don't have the time to go over each one of these plots, but the plots on the right are the rate versus cum plots for the oil and the gas phase. So you can quickly eyeball the rate versus cum for the oil and get an idea of where that EUR is going to be headed. That's going to be important context as we work through the recovery factor module. And if you recall, we worked the flowing material balance interpretation. We walked through the different regimes you might see in the production data and the interpretation that's associated with the flowing material balance and my estimates for the tank. And again, the purpose of all these slides going forward are, I'm showing you my estimates. You're more than welcome to disagree with these interpretations. The purpose is to show you the workflow. And in this particular case, the oil in place interpretation that's associated with the slope of this line is 1.4 million barrels of oil. Okay, that's where we left off at the previous presentation. And here is the recovery factor module workflow applied on that same production data. So here's a 4-pack of plots. The plot on the left is the instantaneous oil gas ratio versus end phase pressure. And what's shown on here are 2 important curves. I don't know, Matthias, can you see my mouse as I hover?
Yeah.
All right. So this line on top is the initial solution gas oil ratio, which was highlighted in the slide before. And the points highlighted are the production data that I'm going to be analyzing on this particular well. This data that's shown here that's not highlighted is after the well had a fracture-driven interaction with another well. So I'm going to be focused on the data prior to that interaction. And what you're seeing here is the instantaneous oil gas ratio, as Leslie mentioned, monotonically decreasing with depletion, which is an expected PVT behavior. And also displayed on here is the RV curve. And the purpose why you have the RV curve, which is the volatilized oil in the gas phase displayed on here, is it kind of brackets and gives you a bottom end of how low your instantaneous oil gas ratio can go, because the assumption behind that RV curve, as many of you know, done the constant volume depletion test in a laboratory, is it's the end case member when only gas is the mobile phase in the reservoir. So it helps you bracket how low can this extrapolation go, which in this case is not very meaningful, but as I transition to some of the gas cases, it will become more apparent. Here's the instantaneous ratios for, in this case, water gas ratio. Here's the bottom hole pressure versus time extrapolation. So in this case, the flowing bottom hole pressures are pretty close to the abandonment pressure assumption of 250 psi. And the flowing material balance interpretation is the bottom right plot. So I'm going to show you the outcomes of this work. Highlighted there are V curves. So the outcomes of, as Leslie talked about, based on the extrapolation of the cumulative ratios, you end up with recovery factors for these phases displayed here. I'm going to focus on the 15% and 90% for gas. And by, just so if it's clear and apparent, multiplying 15% by the 1.2 million shown previously as the tank estimate, you get an ultimate EUR. It's just recovery factor times what's in place is your ultimate recovery, and the recovery factor in this case is a flowing material balance recovery factor. And since none of you can anchor on what these numbers mean or how are they relevant, I'm just going to show a comparison with a completely different method, just so you have some sort of anchor for what these numbers mean with if you were to do the same analysis on the same wall using another method. And I'm going to display a decline curve analysis that was done on these wells using an automatic fitting algorithm, and those ranges using decline curve analysis on the same well gave a range somewhere between 190 to 290,000 barrels of oil. So in this instance, it fell closer to the P90 estimate of another independent analysis. So I'm just kind of displaying what you would get from a decline curve analysis. I'm displaying a technical workflow on that same well. The next example is a Delaware Basin Wolfcamp oil well. This is a parent well. Production data as we displayed. And in this particular interpretation, as we work through this example, what we notice is a relatively higher contactor pore volume that's associated with a lot of oil and a lot of gas and water in the system. And the contacted oil in place, I'm going to emphasize, is 3.3 million barrels of oil for this particular interpretation. Similarly, here's a recovery factor analysis done on that same well, focused on the data prior to fracture-driven interaction for display purposes. Here's a bottom hole pressure extrapolation. Here's a water-gas ratio extrapolation, and the oil-gas ratio extrapolation. In this case, the RV curve is more meaningful, displayed in gray. And this one, in this particular system, you start off, it's apparently saturated in the reservoir. That's why the initial solution gas oil ratio is shown a little bit higher than what the actual data shows. But what you're seeing here is an extrapolation of the oil gas ratio versus time and the resulting recovery factors for the oil phase, gas phase, and the EURs displayed with decline curve estimates for reference. So this is the water oil example in the Permian, Delaware. And it does a decent job of extrapolating to high water EURs as well. The next example is a Delaware Basin Wolfcamp gas well, fully bounded in full. And I'm going to highlight something here. This is 550 barrels per million, which is on the wetter side for the for everything as a whole, perhaps not for the Delaware Basin. So the initial GOR is 4430. Here's the flowing material balance interpretation that we worked through in our previous webinar. Contactor oil in place close to 1.2 million barrels of oil, 5.2 BCF for gas. One of the questions that came out of the previous webinar is, how does this work for gas condensate reservoirs? So I'm just going to show you the tank oil saturation as an outcome of the flowing material balance. This looks awful lot like a CVD test, which is basically a condensate bank as you hit saturation pressure, just FYI. And I'm going to highlight a pairing here on purpose, which is a saturation that is relatively lower than 40%, something close to 40% initial water saturation. By design, I'm going to show you what happens when you pair a low water saturation with a high water producing well. That's one of the points that Leslie pointed out. Here are the extrapolations by now you should be familiar with. And what I wanted to highlight is essentially an oil recovery factor with this extrapolation close to 33% and an oil recovery factor, an oil EUR close to 385, displayed with the ranges from decline curve analysis. And the point I wanted to point you to is the water recovery factor that's associated with pairing essentially a high water producing well with a low water saturation. You get what looks like a pretty unrealistic water recovery factor, which is telling you something about the system you're producing from. Right. The next example was an Anadarko Basin Woodford gas well. This is a parent well. We walked into this analysis recognizing that the estimates are going to be conservative. Gas well with an initial GOR close to 7,600. Here's the flowing material balance analysis. Pore volume was close to 3 million. The contacted gas in place was close to 4 BCF. And in this case, we feel pretty certain that the Anadarko Woodford does not have a mobile water in situ. So in this case, we did an analysis that is a hydrocarbon phase only assumption. And as Leslie pointed out, the instantaneous ratios in this example are pretty noisy. And I will try to address this in a couple of slides coming forward in the interest of time of how do you deal with really noisy data. And as Leslie pointed out, you work with cumulative ratios to help with that. Water is turned off for this particular example, so I'm only focused on the oil and gas recovery factors. And in this case, you'll notice here that the instantaneous ratios are falling above the RB curve, and the associated recovery factor for oil phase apparently seems really high. Is close to 60%. That leads to a 250,000 barrel oil EUR compared to our decline curve analysis. So these were the 4 field examples that we showed in our previous webinar. Their recovery factor analysis performed on those 4 wells for your reference and where they fall on the spectrum compared to another method. Hopefully the takeaway from here is here's what the instantaneous oil gas ratio and water gas ratio is doing these particular wells. How do you digitize it? How do you work with it? And you get estimates of recovery factor that are paired with a tank volume to get EURs. I'll cover a couple of practical considerations as you're sitting there wondering, hey, how do I obtain some reasonable forecasts for your instantaneous ratios or your final cumulative ratios? And the point I'm going to make here is the uncertainty, the most practical uncertainty you're going to face when you're trying to forecast your recovery factors is going to be on your instantaneous oil gas ratio. And I'm going to highlight that example with a what if on this particular well, which was the bounded near critical gas well in the Wolfcamp, Delaware portion of the Wolfcamp. So I'm going to slide the forecast start date to the first 100 days. And I'm going to pretend that I have a lot of uncertainty in the way I would project in the absence of this data. And I'm going to show you a high and a low case. And I'm going to show you what the sensitivity to EURs are going to be and help you can get some context on what we're trying to do with recovery factors and what that uncertainty means and what those cumulative ratios translate to EURs. So what are we doing here with these 3 different forecasts? Of instantaneous ratio, oil gas ratio versus sand phase pressure. Here's displayed basically converted to a time scale with log on the x-axis, just so I can crunch the entire forecast in a reasonable plot. So what you'll see here is the optimistic one has a shallow yield decline compared to a very high yield decline for the pessimistic case, and here's the base case. Eventually, as part of the process, as Leslie talked about, these get converted to a cumulative ratio for material balance purposes. And I'm going to focus on what the cumulative ratios are at abandonment. The point I want to convey is depending on optimistic or pessimistic, you have very different cumulative values of OGR, which is cum oil divided by cum gas, at abandonment. Okay, so the point being, you can have widely different forecasts for the same data for what your cumulative ratios are going to be at abandonment conditions. And they all look like pretty reasonable forecasts. Now, how do you rationalize what is a right number? And the uncertainty that's associated with these 3 different forecasts on this plot right here are converted to a complicated plot here on the right, which is recovery factor on the y-axis, EUR on the secondary y-axis, and cumulative ratio on the x-axis. And the relationship you want to leave with here is the relationship between cumulative ratio at abandonment and recovery factor, and thereby EUR, is a linear relationship. That's something you want to bear in mind. So the uncertainty in the way you forecast these ratios translate to a linear impact on recovery factors, going from 24% to 52% and almost a 2x EUR as those scale. So there's going to be one slide that I'm going to show about how do you rationalize a good instantaneous or good forecast for your ratios for the life of the well in order to get reasonable recovery factors. The takeaway from this slide is the uncertainties, at least in this context of this recovery factor module, a linear relationship. So as Leslie mentioned, the purpose is basically combining of this method is to get reliable estimates of the cumulative ratios at abandonment paired with an abandonment average reservoir pressure to calculate oil and gas recovery factors. And the basis for this is Dr. Lake's book and Walsh's book. And you can also find this in the Petroleum Engineering Handbook. And the next slide is basically something that I did not realize as a simulation engineer is these equations are not mutually exclusive from reservoir simulation. And the point of this slide is in a reservoir simulator, you are using a numerical simulation to forecast these ratios versus time. We take it for granted because we simulated with a set of assumptions gives us those ratio predictions and the abandonment pressure over time. However, if they're consistent under expansion drive assumptions, which most unconventional reservoirs fall within, if you use the same cumulative ratios and abandonment average reservoir pressure, if they're consistent in a reservoir simulation and consistent in flowing material balance theory, the recovery factors will be identical. I did not realize this as a reservoir simulation engineer, so I'm going to make an obvious slide here in case you were not aware. And the reason that's relevant is you might need a reservoir simulation backup to have a good forecast for what your instantaneous ratios do versus pressure. It is okay to have, like we have an empirical / hybrid approach where we bound the problem using simulation and analog production data. And our preferred method, and the preference is personal. It can be any of the other methods to kind of rationalize where the endpoints are going to be for your cumulative ratios. The one that we prefer is cumulative GOR versus QMOIL. The reason we like this particular plot, again, the source for this is Steve Jones' paper, is for one, it clearly displays the differences between a tight infill versus a parent, and it also helps rationalize. You can add public data in this plot as well. That's the plot we've ended up. And again, the two examples you'll be dealing with in a practical sense are going to be places in which yield / GOR are going to be a strong function of flow and bottom hole pressure. Delaware Basin and Anadarko Merrimack are examples where the average reservoir pressure can have a strong influence on producing GOR. So this plot can be used to construct reasonable ratio forecasts. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's the cumulative GOR on the y-axis, cumulative oil on the x-axis, and what's displayed here is the actual data. So imagine you have a parent well that's fully unbounded. And here's a forecast that's constructed. And the abandonment average reservoir pressure, the abandonment cumulative ratio is displayed right here. Here's the ultimate recovery for oil that's associated with that forecast. So here's a parent type curve. And if you have an analog for a tightly bound infill well, here's how a tightly bound infill well might appear in a cumulative GOR versus QMOIL plot. There's two things that's going on with the tightly bound infill. One is the tank size could be smaller because it's a bound infill and it's tightly drilled. And the other one is you're more efficiently depleting the smaller tank that's associated with the infill. So what you'll notice is a very rapid increase in instantaneous GOR, and an outcome of that is an abandonment cumulative OGR or GORP in this case that's much higher compared to that of the parent. If you have this analog data, and the question is, I'm drilling, hopefully by now, drilling something that's at a looser spacing, not as tightly drilled and not as poor as an EUR as this tightly drilled one, and the other extreme is your parent, you can bound the problem for how you extrapolate your instantaneous ratio. At least you have a line of sight as to where your ultimate ratios are headed by looking at an analog of tightly drilled infill and the other extreme, which is an unbounded parent well. So the question is, how will a loosely drilled pilot perform? And here's how we contextualize the forecast is we plot some of our newer infills in this context, and we build our forecast that are somewhere between bounded by these two extremes. So hopefully this leaves you with the context for you are not blind in your SAM phase instantaneous ratio versus SAM phase pressure extrapolation. This plot is a good companion for making good reasonable ratio forecast to plug in for the recovery factor analysis. And this is just an example. You could do the same for the water. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to skip over some of these points. I did not anticipate we'd have time to talk about. I'm anticipating some questions around these 3 points right here. And finally, summarizing, giving you some concluding remarks. We showed you several field examples. We showed you some simulation. It's not bulletproof. It is user judgment. You're using user judgment to forecast your ratio sources time versus using a simulator to project your ratios and abandon pressure over time. The recovery factor approach is simple and elegant. All reservoir engineers can have a seat at the table of a good prediction or a technical prediction. You can bound the problem with analog data. It follows fundamental material balance equations, and if done consistently, can be consistent with reservoir simulation. We have applied this on 1,000+ wells. It's one of the workflows that we do on our unconventional well production data. And finally, to end with, there's always going to be skepticism with the new method. I would suggest try it out on the SPE data repository. This is publicly available data released through SPE. Those are our concluding remarks, and in the interest of time, we'll skip over to questions and try to address them as we go. Any comments from my other 2 panelists?
Great. Before we go into any questions, Narayan, first of all, of course, the webinar will be like the recording will be distributed. So that's the first clarification. Maybe there's any comments from you, Barry, before we take a few questions.
No, the only final comment I'd add is, you know, at Cimarex and now Coterra, we found such great value in this methodology, not because it's perfect, but because it's physically rigorous, and it forces us to cast all of our questions into a material balance based framework of how our wells are performing, and we've found that to just be very, very valuable.
Perfect. So I think we can go ahead and start with a few questions. We tried to answer a few of them in the chat as well, but the first one was kind of answered there, and it's related to whether this methodology would perform well in conventional reservoirs as well, and not only unconventional reservoirs. So I'll give that question to Leslie for starters.
I've never tried it in conventional reservoirs, but since they would get into pseudo-steady state a lot faster than an unconventional, my suspicion is that it would work even better.
Yep, it's a good answer. I think there's some consensus around that. There was some questions related to, for instance, the multiphase flow cases in the Permian Delaware, where there's a lot of water, and maybe water is the main in situ fluid. Will the method work well there? And you answered it in the chat, Barry, but maybe you'd like to ask that or to answer that as well.
Yeah, I believe the question specifically asked in cases where water may actually be the main phase in situ. At least one of those examples that Narayan was showing you, that was the case on that field example. And there's a lot of different reservoirs that we're targeting in the Delaware, but I would say most of the reservoirs that are being actively developed today, specifically Bone Springs and Upper Wolfcamp, are very, very high water saturation, high water cut plays. We found tremendous value of using this technique in those plays because it forces us to rationalize because it's all material balance based, it forces us to really rationalize our petrophysical models. And what we often found was with the petrophysical models we had before we started using this technique, we couldn't generate reservoir simulations that would produce as much water as our wells were producing. As we started forcing ourselves to analyze all of our wells through this material balance lens, we found that we also couldn't justify the high water recoveries that this would need to show if you're trying to honor a material balance. And so, as we studied it more and more, it caused us to sharpen our pencil on our petrophysical models, which then allowed us to tie this technique with reservoir simulation, and improve our overall understanding of the play. So that's a long answer, but the short answer is yes, it works wonderfully. It's agnostic as to what the primary fluid is, but the real I'll use this word loosely. The real genius of forcing yourself to analyze a well through this lens is that you have to honor the material balance. It doesn't allow you to take any shortcuts. I don't know if Narayan, you have anything to add to that.
That's the reason we added the field example from the Delaware Basin. I agree.
Good. We'll do, there's a question related to main drive mechanism. So can you use this approach to identify the main drive mechanism?
The whole theory is based on a tank that is depleting due to expansion. So it doesn't apply to water influx or anything like that. I don't know how else to answer that question. I mean, I can't apply it to a drive with water influx if I can't account for it, if it's not part of the tank. I don't know if that answers or not.
Yeah, it was, I'll take a stab at that. I think the answer to that question is we certainly haven't tried to apply it in such a manner, and I'm not quite sure the techniques as they're developed today would be very enlightening. I think you could obviously make a prediction, and if your well is performing great, quite differently, you could use that to infer that you might have a different drive mechanism. Unfortunately, these plotting techniques were not specifically developed to identify drive mechanisms. And so there's enough unknowns in the input that it could be a different drive mechanism, or it could also simply be a variety of other inputs that are causing you to make predictions that aren't following your well performance. So if I were looking for drive mechanisms, I don't think this workflow would be at the top of my list. Narayan, do you have any additional insight?
No, basically the same thing. I would think you can try it out, but I would have no confidence in the results. But I would imagine if you have a water drive, these answers would be extremely conservative compared to what you would expect out of a water drive system, right? Or any other pressure support system, because this is purely expansion drive. I agree.
Right. So just while we're kind of at drives and water and whatnot, there's a kind of follow-up question on this with in terms of recovery factors in the Permian for water, sometimes calculated to be over 100%. So there's a gentleman that mentions that, and producing more than the volume of the SRV. Have you seen similar issues to that, or
We certainly used to. When we first started trying to apply more material balance based techniques to our wells, we would consistently run into examples where the recovery of the system was over 100% of the water that we thought was there. What we found over time was that our petrophysical model needed a lot of refinement, and our estimates of just how much reservoir our wells were touching needed to expand quite a bit as well. And there's a variety of reasons, and I'm sure it's going to be different through all. I will add that I think the two biggest value adders that we saw was that our wells were touching a lot more reservoir than we were originally accounting for, and additionally, a lot of the core handling techniques, leave a lot to be desired in terms of water voidage as we're handling the cores and bringing our cores to surface. And so we also found that we needed to be very careful on the water saturations we were matching to in our petrophysical model, and we needed to account for that water voidage. And when we did both of those things combined, I don't think it's very common now that we find wells where the water recovery is over 100%. In fact, now we're arguing about whether or not the water recovery is we're arguing about how reasonable the recovery factor itself is. Is it 17% or is it 25%? Ryan, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I agree. It's our preconceived notions about what our frac intervals were. For those who follow the HFTS2 publications, I think that's pretty instructive on what we think we're touching with these Wolfcamp A wells.
Right. Just quick to Barry, can you elaborate on what you mean by petrophysical model refinement?
Yeah, so all of the labs have different core handling techniques, and whenever you bring rock to surface and expose it to lower pressures, you're going to have water voidage out of that rock. Whenever the labs then analyze your rocks and you're getting your initial saturations, they're tuning to saturations that are still present in the rock. And oftentimes there will be an assumption that any voidage that has happened is just gas voidage, that there's been, and they'll assign all of that voidage to gas. In a lot of these reservoirs, that's just not accurate. There's a lot of water voidage as well. And so, we found that we really needed to account for that in our petrophysical models, and that our water saturations that we were, quote, tuning to with our petrophysical models, that we were getting based upon core measurements, were actually quite a bit lower than what was really in place in situ before that voidage happened.
Excellent. The last question that we'll do just with in terms of time, and then I'm sure these guys will be available for questions later as well. But that's a question related to kind of these tank models. They assume, or they have certain assumptions. So will transient behaviors in space time impact the theory or the basis of the theory?
Okay, what was the question?
So when you're dealing with tank models, then there's certain assumptions related to that. While in these low perm reservoirs, we see a lot of transient effects. And can you just comment quickly on how that potentially impacts the theory, or how that's handled by the theory, and what the theory assumes?
Okay, the whole underlying assumption of the theory is that when you get to pseudo-steady state, every point in that reservoir decompresses at the same rate. Okay, as I said, we tried that on a zillion different simulations, and it seems to work. Now, that the fact that the row by the material balance time becomes constant at every point, it's not like it's constant. It's not like it's a flat density profile. There is a density profile across the reservoir. It's just saying that at every point in that reservoir, that density profile is decreasing at the same rate. So it's not exactly a tank model, and it's not.
Leslie, if you don't mind me chiming in, this is intended for long-term production data. If you're interested in analyzing transient flow, there are other solutions like RTA and numerical RTA you should probably rely on.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure what the guy has in his mind, but in a tank there's only one pressure, there's one saturation, there's one everything. Everything is instantaneous, everything is flat, and this is not the case here. This is just like pseudo-steady state and in liquid theory, where you have a pressure profile across the reservoir, but every point in that reservoir, the pressure is changing at exactly the same rate with time once you get into pseudo-steady state at constant rate. It's the same kind of idea. That's what the theory is built on.
Good. So I think on that note, I'll just thank you all for joining the webinar. Also, thanks again to Leslie, Barry, and Narayan for presenting and sharing this. And if there's any questions, feel free to either send them to us or to any of the presenters directly.